This is A Line Around Your Thoughts, a podcast that centers on conversations with artists, writers, musicians, and creatives from around the Inland Northwest. I'm Iannelli, and I'm joined today in the Rocart Media studio by author Jess Walter, whose new novel is titled So Far Gone. So welcome, Jess.
Thanks, EJ. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you again. Because we already chatted in some capacity. You know, I was wearing my Inlander hat, and that article was destined for the Inlander. But I think I said at the time, you know, there's going to be so much that winds up on the cutting room floor, and it would be really nice to explore some of those tangents that don't get bundled into the article. So, it would be nice.
So if it's an Inlander hat, what is your podcast apron or
it is my
suit?
podcast apron. I think that's fitting. This will be an opportunity to kind of explore some of those tangents that didn't necessarily get bundled into, because as you know, as a former reporter, your word count, when you're constrained by word count, there are certain things that just,
it's
have
one
to get
of
admitted.
The wild things about writing a novel too is you spend a year, 2, 3, 5 years on something, and then there's this reductive thing that happens where you have to go talk about it, and so you find yourself distilling it down to a few ideas, which is really helpful for explaining what a book is about. But there's a moment probably about a year after a book comes out when I go back and read it, and I'm like, it's so much more than that, because I start to believe the distilled version in my mind almost. So.
Well, that's encouraging rather than the other way around where you think, oh, this is a little thin and threadbare. So
no, they almost all, when I go back to them, I think, oh, this was more than the 3 sentences that I say in interviews or the hour that I talk at a reading or something. It's like you do try to fill them with as much life as you can fit in 200 or 300 or 400 pages.
Well, for the benefit of listeners, let's do the distilled version now, so they know about this new novel, So Far Gone, and what we're talking about here.
Yeah, So Far Gone is a story of an environmental newspaper reporter named Reese Kinnick, who's lost his job and is adrift, I guess you'd say. And he gets in a fight with his son-in-law, who's a conspiracy theorist, and punches him and throws his cell phone out the car window, and goes to live off the grid north of Spokane, near where my family lived. And the action sort of picks up 7 years after all that, when 2 kids show up on his porch and they turn out to be his grandchildren, and he has to come out of this sort of self-created exile to try to bring his family back together in a world that has somehow gotten even crazier in the 7 years he's been gone.
Yeah, and one of the things that we had talked about was how this was in some ways circling all the way back to Ruby Ridge, and some of the themes that were addressed there, and then the mainstreaming of the fringe that has happened, unfortunately, in the decades since.
My reporting career began in the late 80s in Spokane, and I guess the high point of my reporting career, certainly the most hard to call a tragedy like that a high point, but the sort of peak of my reporting was the Ruby Ridge case in North Idaho in 1992. White separatist family on a mountaintop in Idaho, and first the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau, and then Marshal Service, and then the FBI. This long series of conflicts that led to an 11-day standoff and the deaths of a U.S. Marshal and Randy Weaver's son and wife. Millions of dollars spent to bring in this character who wasn't really, a major criminal. He had been, but that was kind of the beginning of me sort of being aware, I guess, of this strain of radical right-wing thought in the Northwest, which, as you just said, has become really the mainstream of America at this point. That kind of conspiracy thinking and government hatred and hatred of really all institutions. And it's kind of the country we find ourselves in now. And so approaching this novel, it did feel almost like I was circling back 30 years and writing again about compounds in Idaho, and doing it from the vantage point of a newspaper reporter, which of course I was.
And so at what point did you begin writing So Far Gone? At what point did you realize this, if I want to capture the zeitgeist, then this is the novel that I'm going to have to write?
You know, it's really hard for me to pinpoint. I almost have to go back and look at my journals, because I'll jot down ideas in my journal. I know I had the image of this grandfather and his grandchildren showing up on his porch in maybe late 2023. And that image just kept coming to me, and I was working on other things, and I just kept thinking, no, this is a book that once I kind of opened my mind to this character, it really came at me fast, you know, and I wanted to capture how quickly the idea was coming to me in the prose and in the structure. I wanted the whole thing to be as immediate as it felt to me. And I was watching in 2024 as politically we were entering this strange place where it looked like Trump was going to win a second term, and what that was going to do to the country, the kind of anxiety, the sort of fear. Felt like I was gripped with these two desires. And I think I showed you this cartoon that visualized it. One was a straight ahead path that said can't look away, and the other one was a right turn off the freeway that said can't look at any of it, you have to get away, you know. And I just kept imagining that road, and imagining what would happen if you took the I can't look at this anymore road and just, you know, tuned all of it out, which I think a lot of people then found themselves in after the election. So it's late 23 when I started working on it, and then all the way through 2024.
Because I think maybe by 2023, it had become clear that this wasn't going away. You know, there was some hope, I think, false hope in 2020 that this was just going to be a blip, that this was just going to be a phase. And so the fact that you end up, this becomes a semi-permanent trend. I hesitate to say permanent, but a semi-permanent trend that then warrants a novel in order to kind of capture it.
And in 2021, when the attack on the House, you know, you felt like, oh, the Republicans are even turning now away from this. They're realizing how dangerous this can be. And it reminded me of a moment actually in 1992, 93, 94, the Oklahoma City bombing, which was a moment in which government officials who had been villainizing the government, you know, the very government they work for, suddenly said, well, maybe we've gone too far, you know. And I really thought the attack on the Capitol was a similar moment. And so it was really watching that, no, this is here to stay. This movement, this almost nihilistic movement that defies parties, really is something almost more guttural and deep in the American spirit, or in where we are as a country, or in what's happened to us with technology. It's hard to know the exact causes, but I didn't want to write a novel that tried to look at the causes so much as look at the effect on families. Yeah,
and since you mentioned nihilism, again, this was another word that came up, and I think one of us had talked about the triumph of nihilism, because this is a movement that seems to be so ideologically galvanized, and yet there doesn't seem to be any principle behind it. It really is almost mercenary and avaricious, simply for its own sake.
Well, and I think it belongs at that emotional level, because it begins, I really think, with conspiracy thinking and with giving people something to blame for their own weakness, their own trouble, their own economic situation, whether that's, you know, it starts out as immigrants, and then it becomes, you know, a certain party, and we all want an easy way out. We all want to believe that there are forces aligned against us that are keeping us from, you know, what the other guy has. The irony of who is sort of leading this movement is, you know, to me that every institution has been undermined except billionaires. I for the life of me, I can't get my mind around that somehow a goodly portion, half of the country perhaps, said, no, I don't trust schools. I don't trust the hospitals anymore. I don't trust doctors. I don't trust journalism. I don't trust the government. You know who I trust? Big business,
Yeah.
That to me is, the last novel, The Cold Millions, was about a class war in which the millionaires at the time were considered to be keeping poorer Americans down, and somehow there's been this shift in which the blame, the opening those doors to allow you to blame people for what you don't have, what you think you should have. It's really created this undercurrent that I didn't think was as severe as it is in the United States, and it is.
Well, you bring up this worrying evolution from a mistrust of the robber barons and big business, and then this suddenly placing one's faith in that.
Yeah.
And I also think, Thoreau is a recurring figure throughout this book. And we move from transcendentalism, which was a kind of a valid movement in its own right. To this strain of nihilism where, it's ideologically bankrupt.
Right. Yeah. And, that Walden, of course, does play a big role in the novel. And Reese, I think that is sort of his dream. And as you and I think talked about, Walden is another myth. There aren't a whole lot of directions you can turn in America without confronting one myth or another.
The man behind the curtain.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so the cynicism is understandable. It's what happens with that cynicism, where it's turned, and how crudely it's used, and the use of cynicism to push people away from institutions that they once trusted, toward a nihilistic future run by billionaires. I mean, it really is the stuff of sci-fi almost, Reese's understanding of what happened is so much based on what his job was, but I don't entirely share his explanation, but it was certainly fun to write. Let's see if I can find the section I was thinking of. Let's see. This is when he's angry at his son-in-law. In his defense, Reese would think later, he had endured 4 years of such nonsense, ever since Shane had traded his mild drug habit for a Jesus and AM radio addiction, real Jews and real patriots, and black on white crime, and owning the libs and the lamestream media, and the vast conspiracy perpetrated on real Americans, by which Shane always meant people like him. This raw sewage had been seeping into American drinking water for years, until it eventually contaminated the mainstream and won over enough Shanes to convince the chattering TV heads and Twitter taters that such half-assed conspiracies were a legitimate part of the body politic, that somehow they had to do with white working class people getting the short end of some imaginary economic stick.
And so in these passages, the kid gloves are off.
Yeah.
And I sense, you say Reese isn't a complete proxy for you,
right?
And the beliefs that you hold, but I do sense that there is some raw emotion that you share with that character that's coming through these passages.
Yeah, definitely. And like any novel, there's a sort of progression that the author takes as well as they're writing it. And I think it did start with a sort of worst case rant that I might unleash at some point, and then, as often happens with me in writing fiction, builds toward opening into the characters and finding out, well, why does Shane feel this way? What's at the base of his fear and his beliefs? Now, a novel is specific to the people in the book, and to write a character like Reese who is unable to escape the worst rant that pops into your head is a kind of fun experiment, to say, what if I felt like this all the time? What if all the time I felt like half of the people in the country had lost their minds? There's a great line from a Celine novel, one of his World War I novels. I think it's Death on the Installment Plan, where he looks around and thinks, I'm the only sane person and everyone else is armed to the teeth, and it can feel like that at times. And so allowing yourself to kind of channel a character like that, it was great fun to write those rants in the beginning.
But even if Rhys kind of channels your inner curmudgeon, you have also said that this isn't entirely his book.
Right.
And you had mentioned some of the other characters, and you said that it's also Bethany's book, and Bethany is his daughter, who's adrift herself, but is looking for safe harbors or refuges in very different things to what her husband Shane is looking for. But it's also Asher's book. Leah and Asher are Rhys's grandchildren, and Bethany's children, and Shane's children. And it's also Asher's book because, and this occurred to me as I was processing our conversation, there's kind of an innocence in experience, and Asher is representative of the innocence that isn't yet corrupted by all of this that's going on around him. Like he's still on the hunt for, asking naive questions and exploring and things like that.
Yeah, that age when information feels like it's around every corner, and he's asking questions all the time. He's testing the limits of his physical ability, which are pretty limited. Asher was a great character, right? The way I wanted the book to be, I like to write books in which more than one point of view. I think I've written one first person novel.
And which one was that?
The Financial Lives of the Poets.
Okay.
And it's very similar to this in that it's very timely. It happens over a short period of time, but it really is just that one character's voice. I didn't want to be with Rhys and his disappointment in the world throughout a whole novel. And I really thought this had to open up and show you that Rhys also has a worldview that requires blame, and that he has his own issues that he has not confronted as well. And when you realize that about your characters, it broadens the thing that you've written, and it opens it up in a way. And I think Asher and Leah, the two children, were also necessary because they've just come into this world. This is the world they know. They're also trying to make sense of it. And I love that you used the word innocence for Asher, because I think that's kind of what he represents, in his desire to go back in time and keep the Spokane tribe's ponies from being slaughtered, by the cavalry. Even in the face of all that horror, he can play that he's a well-meaning Indian scout helping the Spokanes hide their ponies from the cavalry, and that was a very different kind of writing experience than writing, a disgruntled former journalist railing at the world around him.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, I hate to keep harking back to that initial conversation, but it provided so much of the fodder here. Yeah. We had talked about Financial Lives of the Poets and how this is a close cousin and exists kind of within the same universe. But when you had mentioned a first-person book, it's weird because I didn't think of that as a strictly first-person book, because it is very much about that constellation of characters and what happens with that constellation of characters. And you have that same intimacy here that you don't necessarily have with Beautiful Ruins or The Cold Millions. This is... this is a little more, the focus is a little more narrowed. Yeah,
those are, what did they used to say in Hollywood, with cast of thousands, they're at least cast of dozens. And The Cold Millions had first person sections in it, but there were, I think, 7 of them, and then third person sections with other characters. And so you're doing a lot, you're playing with point of view. I wanted this to be smoother. I feel like hopefully the chapters move, even though we'll introduce another character and bring them in, and then be able to sort of access their thoughts, it really does sort of stay tightly on this question of, is Reese going to find his grandchildren? Just that simple quest really appealed to me in a book in which, so much is current and is the anxiety that we're carrying now. I wanted to just ask that one question: can he get his family back?
Yeah, and they have to move, which gives them that physical propulsion. So everything's not entirely static, like a journey around my room where it's taking place in a single setting. But that also enabled you to explore the different, through that geography, explore these different ideas and mindsets that you've described as just a series of almost alternate realities that live alongside one another.
Yeah, it was, as I was writing, I kept thinking about, books that I love from different periods, and that period in the 1960s, as we talked about, when it was called the generation gap, and this reality gap. Sometimes I will sit and just watch Fox News or watch OAN and just soak it in and think about the America that I would be seeing there. And we are seeing totally different versions of the same country. We are seeing photographic negatives of the world they're seeing and vice versa. And that's remarkable. And I think in many ways, whatever other causes there are, whatever other sociological, economic, political things are going on, it's really the inability to share a common reality that is the root cause of what ails us. And so to be able to capture that in fiction, even in a small way, we don't spend much time in Shane's head, and it's at a very fraught moment. Mm-hmm. But I think it's really telling to find him accessing some early fears and some early, what draws him sort of into the Christianity that then leads him toward, Christian nationalism. And the fact that it comes from, I think, a pretty honest and fearful place was, for me, a character opens up to you in a way that you feel kind of honored to have gotten their story almost, and I kind of felt that way with Shane. I also didn't want to belabor that. I don't feel like that there's an equivalency in these two worldviews. I definitely feel like Reese's worldview is much more reality-based, much more science-based, but that comes clearly from the world that I see, and so I didn't want to give them the same weight, but I wanted to nod at the fact that they had more in common than they would have ever believed.
Yeah, and these characters are, through their very existence, kind of responses to the question that is implied by the title, but certainly isn't asked. So in the title saying "so far gone," you can imagine a question mark behind that. Right. Like, is the country too far gone? Are we as individuals too far gone to ever reconcile? And so the different trajectories that you have these characters taking are, in some ways, various responses to that question.
Right. Yeah, and it's an open-ended question. You can't answer that in a novel. You can sort of hopefully answer for the characters, for the world you've created, and yet it's. I think even then I had to leave the novel with a certain ambiguity because, we aren't going to fix this. We didn't fix it in 2020. It didn't fix it in 2022, and certainly didn't fix it in 2024. And so I don't know that an election can do it. I don't know that judges can do it. I think it's. I don't know, and it's terrifying to not know where this could all lead. And here we are 3 months into the Trump presidency, and it is in many ways worse than anyone could have imagined. Yeah. And it feels worse in ways that are straining the limits of government's restraint of itself, of this system of checks and balances, of journalism, of law. Everywhere it feels like there are these attacks against the things that keep the system from being, totally corrupted. And so, that question, that question that I think you're exactly right, that the book asks, are we too far gone, becomes for me more and more important as time goes on. And then we have to ask ourselves, when you turn away, as Reese did, you're not complicit, certainly, but is there something more you could be doing? For him, is there something more he could be doing? Could he have kept his family from some of this by not running off into the woods? For the rest of us, I don't think you have to look at CNN 6 times a day, or actually about 6 times an hour like I do, but I don't think you necessarily have to donate to candidates. I don't think there's any one answer, but I do think turning away is not the answer.
Yeah, and in you saying that characters, you can't answer these questions in a novel, but as an author, you do have creative control. Yeah. And so did you feel some sort of maybe quiet impetus to steer these characters in a certain direction so that there was some element of redemption, so that we were left with some degree of hope after all this?
I think I did say you can't steer the characters, but I should have said I can't, because I couldn't. My imagination does not allow me a place where Reese and his son-in-law all of a sudden see the exact same world. The architecture of their brains has been altered by technology, by the media that they consume, by religion, by all these things. And so, but what I could do was imagine what would give them common cause. Right. And it was family. It is the people that you love, the community that you're in. I think that extends to larger questions of community too. There was a story about a community that is fully behind Trump. I think he won there by 30 or 40 points, and they just deported a mother and restaurant owner that everyone in the community loved, and it stopped them cold, And I do think, if I have any hope, it's that those relationships will bridge this reality gap that I think we're in. But I think everyone has probably someone in their family that they've lost touch with, that they can't talk about certain things with. I don't think the Kinnick's Thanksgiving is unique in erupting in some sort of disagreement. And so, we've got our work cut out for us. And in previous times, it's sometimes taken an economic crisis or a world war or something else to kind of bring people back together. Hopefully it won't take that, but eventually I do think people come back around to, if not seeing the world the same way, at least imagining a future for children that is better. And so, yeah, I think I think I usually tend toward hope. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I think I'm a sort of hopeful cynic. Like, I start with cynicism and then I move toward the possibility of redemption, I guess.
And in that story that you cited of the small town that had voted overwhelmingly for Trump, right. And then once the deportation started, then they started having a rethink. I read that same story, yeah. And the thing that struck out to me, or the quote, they interviewed one gentleman, and he said, this is what we voted for. And, these other people are kind of having buyer's remorse, but I'm not, because I wanted deportations. Wow. And so it got me thinking about the possibility for redemption and whether that exists for everyone. And of course, that has parallels here too, and So Far Gone, because there are characters for whom, for whatever reason, redemption just doesn't come.
Right.
I think of Dean Burris.
Yes, yeah, and there's a character who there really was a person who was. I saw this news story about a poacher who was killing deer and then leaving them for eagles and then killing the eagles because eagle feathers are worth so much. So there really was an eagle poacher, and it was so hard for me to imagine that character, that person, like even waking up in the morning and looking himself in the mirror. It seemed like such a grimly anti-American thing to do. And so I do like sometimes to create a character who expresses real villainy, and that was the guy that I thought, well, I can at least, especially if I find myself writing in Shane's point of view, this is a character that I can allow to just exist as a dark force in the novel. I don't need to see much of his childhood to, I'm not going to excuse his behavior because he might have been bullied in fourth grade. It's we're just going to stick with the fact that this guy is an irredeemable human. So as a fiction writer, I don't create very many of those, but in this case, maybe it was the last bit of Reese's anger that allowed me to create that guy.
And the voice in this book is very much, I think, a Jess Walter that I certainly recognize, not just from your novels, but from your live short story readings and I think a lot of folks will recognize the voice here. And you had, I don't want to suggest that this is less literary, but I felt like The Cold Millions and Beautiful Ruins were a little more literary, a little more poetic, whereas this prose ends up trying to mirror the freneticism of the time.
Yeah, I think that very much. I guess maybe introspective, and the structure of those other books, the amount of time that they cover, Beautiful Ruins covers 50 years essentially, and has this broad, scope of characters, trying to come up with a more almost. They're not asking larger questions, certainly, because these are big questions in this book, but they certainly are ones you can ruminate in more. What does art mean? What does it mean to lead a valuable life? Those are the sorts of questions. This is, can I get my daughter and my grandkids back? This is a really straightforward question. It felt like it wanted straightforward prose. It felt like it, and it's funny you mentioned live readings, because I like to balance suspense and humor, and it's a great thing to do at a live reading. Have people sort of on the edge of their seats and then have them something unexpected and funny happen. And I wanted this to be a picaresque, a wild road trip that crosses borders into kind of insanity. And so setting out to write it, I definitely felt a different voice. And if there's anything that I commit to in writing, it's to letting the story tell me how it wants to be told. And this one felt like it wanted, like I said, it came to me fast. It came to me with a sense of immediacy. And I wanted to almost ride that all the way through. I didn't want to get off the mechanical bull until my 30 seconds were up or whatever. And so every book is kind of an experiment. What would happen if I just kept this energy up through the whole thing and wrote and got out of my way almost, and didn't think about being literary, but just told this story as it's coming to me. And it along the way tried to be as funny and as wild as possible. And, you finish the experiment and, the volcano erupts, or the elements, interacted against one another in their way they're going to, and then you have to ask yourself, did that work? And I finished, I thought that worked. I really liked what ended up coming out.
Yeah, and even though an election can't necessarily change such, I think, deep-seated problems that's not going to be solved with a single election, and you had already mentioned that. But I think if there had been a different outcome, this book would have been issued into a somewhat different a different world. And that's kind of an interesting thought experiment.
That was one of the strangest things, honestly, was writing it in 2024, and it would be like, you know, Kamala's ahead in Iowa. And I would look at the book and I would think, no, she's not. You know, like the world I was writing felt more representative of what it felt to me like the world was headed toward. And, you know, it's not just the United States. A far right candidate won in Poland yesterday. Yeah. And we are at a point when the fissures in society have brought forth a kind of nationalism that we haven't seen really since World War I, honestly. I mean, even the nationalism of World War II was more reactive from what was left over from that war. And so we're in sort of uncharted waters. And what is that? Think globally, act locally, you know? It's sort of grim advice when globally it feels like everything's out of control, but how are you possibly to act globally? You know, I mean, there is that's almost not an option. And so I think we continue to break it down to smaller groups, to communities, to the world we know. And we hope that, I think Reese describes it as almost a weather event. You know, we hope this thing doesn't destroy too many houses before it blows through.
Yeah, and by breaking it down into those smaller pieces, it allows us to kind of make sense of it and feel as though it's approachable and manageable. Yeah. And I think some of the overwhelming nature of it, especially this makes it feel as though it's unmanageable and it's completely out of control. And I just wondered,
I don't think any writer was ever rooting more against the premise of their novel being timely. Honestly, I mean, I thought, you know what? If it turns out that we've moved past the days of you know, a group like the Army of the Lord in this book having free reign, then I will gladly write another book, or I'll rewrite this one. But as you know, I finished a draft right around November of 2024 and sent it to my editor. And before the election, in fact, I think it was October, I finished a draft, and it was pretty much the way it is now. You know, this is sort of where I thought we were headed, and you know, we sort of took a breath, and then in November said, no, this is the book to publish.
Yeah, I'm sad that it was prescient.
Yes,
you know, it's kind of heartbreaking that it was so. But do you think that people will end up turning to this to some degree for that sense making, or even just to find solace in that, you know, that age old adage that misery loves company, and you know, you can kind of see your world reflected in this, and it just.
I do know some readers will be turned away for this, you know, for the same reason that Reese wants to leave it all behind. They would rather look away, and that's totally understandable. The great thing about a novel is not everyone has to like it. I think what I've heard from readers so far is there's a real catharsis in Reese's rant early on. It opens up into an experience that so many people have had, where someone that they were close to now seems to be on the other side of some divide, and you don't know how to get them back. And then you know, Reese's attempts to redeem himself and to regain his daughter's trust and love is really what is at the heart of the book. And so I think, like with any novel, you know, you can hear a description of it, but what really happens is you fall in line with people who hopefully become sort of real to you in the amount of time that you spend in the book. And that's what I keep hearing from readers is, you know, that they're sort of on board with Reese's rant. And then they find a world opening up that looks familiar to them. And, you know, nothing is more comforting than recognizing the world,
Yeah.
and we don't really recognize it right now. We're out of sorts. And so, in the end of a novel, if a character comes home and finds their family, that's a world we recognize and that is innately hopeful, I think.
I know you didn't come prepared for readings, although we had one at the outset. Is there, as we close, is there a reading that you think is a fitting way to kind of close the conversation?
Boy, that's a good question.
And I don't know if you want to end on that hopeful note, or maybe deliver something where folks can find that catharsis.
Yeah, I mean, I can read the very end of the novel, which actually doesn't give anything away. Reese and his daughter are down. Reese's ex-wife has passed away, and they're down along the Spokane River. And this is them walking down by the river. On that day, there was only a little bit of garbage, which they quickly gathered up. Bethany handing Reese the mostly empty garbage sack and saying, "Give me a minute?" "Of course," he said, and she wandered away from him toward the river's edge, where she crouched down and seemed to talk to herself for a few minutes. Reese felt like he should give her some privacy, so he wandered downstream 50 feet. He stood there, listening to the water babble over ancient exposed boulders. The river was incredibly low that fall, rocks and rebar and rounded old bricks emerging in the shallows like prehistoric bones rising from the deep. Up along the canyon walls, sunlight made clouds of late hatching caddisflies glow like lit candles above the treetops. What a lovely spot, Reese thought. Celia would have liked it here. After a few minutes, Bethany stepped up beside him. "I come down here sometimes and talk to her," she said. "Catch her up on what's going on." "I'll bet she appreciates that," Kinnick said. He wanted to tell his daughter that he wouldn't mind having his own ashes scattered here, too, one day, but it seemed somehow presumptuous of him. "Do you want to know what I said to her today?" Bethany asked. Kinnick nodded, and she reached out and took her father's hand. "I told her not to worry. You were home now."
And I hate to spoil that mood, but just like there's an epilogue of sorts there's an epilogue of sorts to this podcast. It's a lightning round.
Yes.
With completely unrelated questions.
All right.
Or semi-related questions.
I love the unrelated ones.
So we'll start. What book of yours would you most like to rewrite or revisit?
Wow, what book of mine? Interestingly enough, I'm doing a quick revision of the Ruby Ridge book, and I'm recording the audio book myself. So I get a chance to kind of go back in and update. I mean, that's a news story. Randy Weaver's died since then. Other things have happened. So I think it's kind of telling. The others, I kind of allow them to be, even in their imperfect natures, done,
Who, in your opinion, is on Spokane's Mount Rushmore?
Spokane's Mount Rushmore. Well, Bing would be up there, I suppose. Boy, Spokane's. I think you'd have to put Chief Gary up there. I mean, I think you need the place has. If the place is named for the tribe that was driven from it, I think you would need to start there. So we've got two. I mean, John Stockton, a lot of people would put up there. Let me think, though. Who else would go on Spokane's Mount Rushmore? I'm going to go with the sports writer John Blanchett, who I think is one of the greatest writers Spokane has ever had, so I'm going to put John up there. Blanchett. Let's see. I've got one more person to put on there. I think it should probably be a woman. That would probably make the most sense. Let's see. Gosh, who's the woman who walked from Spokane to in the 1800s? Gosh,
it's on the tip of my tongue, and it's just not coming.
Oh boy! All right, then I'll have to go somewhere else. I'm going to go Sydney Sweeney.
Okay.
We need someone
a contemporary.
We need
star,
a contemporary person. Yeah.
Oh, that's a nice mix.
Yeah, it's a good mix. Yeah, and I think it would be a challenge for a sculptor to get those four people up there.
And I wish I had that name at the ready.
I know. I can see it. The book is called. I can't even think of the book now. That's what happens in the lightning round, is you're trusting a faulty memory.
Exactly. And no time to consult Wikipedia.
Right, exactly.
Do you have a car that you remember fondly?
I'm a kind of a car guy. I have a 1963 Lincoln Continental convertible right now that I drive around town. And
you did not pull up in that.
I didn't. No, it's I was in a hurry, so it takes about 30 minutes just to get the thing running. But I've always loved that Lincoln. I've had it. My mom's stepfather owned it, and then when my mom passed away, I bought it from my dad. And so it's convertible. It's the Kennedy car. But I also had a 240Z when I was a kid. So
okay.
And I had a Mustang. So I've had some cars in my days.
And then finally, Reese is prone to certain rants. Is there any pet peeve that will get you almost reliably on a soapbox?
Wow. I have a pretty even temper. I'm pretty even keeled. But when people will tell me how much better the NBA was in the 1980s, I want to just smack them in the face, because it's unwatchable. It's like wrestling. And if you want to go back and watch Bill Lambier, go ahead. But I think the NBA is the most glorious, lovely game right now. And the 3-point shot is the greatest thing that's happened in sport since anything. So since someone first threw a ball through a peach basket. So that, I suppose that's my rant, is stop longing for 1980s NBA, like make the NBA great again or whatever. It's that kind of reactionary thinking that is going to end the whole human experiment, because you people can't give up your terrible basketball.
It is one thing about the present that we can be grateful for.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jess. I appreciate it.